The ballroom went silent for 3 full seconds before she reached the center of it. Not because she wore diamonds worth more than some penthouses in Tribeca. Not because the emerald silk gown wrapped around her like royalty. But because every powerful person in that room knew exactly who she was. The black wife Korean mafia financier, Cairo Han, had publicly humiliated just 2 days earlier. Simone Hayes walked out of that elevator alone. No escort. No announcement. No husband. Just an emerald silk gown that moved like water around her body, diamonds sharp enough to catch every chandelier light in the ballroom, and the kind of calm expression that made powerful people uncomfortable, because it looked exactly like someone who already knew how the night would end. She was not supposed to be here. Every person in that ballroom knew it. Because 48 hours earlier, the entire country had watched her husband lean back in a leather chair inside his Central Park penthouse for an interview and smile at a camera like the answer cost him nothing. Simone hates attention. She's traditional. Honestly, she's too boring for these crowds. The clip had gone viral across every platform before sunrise. By morning, social media mocked Simone mercilessly. Commentators called her the invisible wife. Fashion bloggers compared her to Cairo's rumored companions. Someone built an entire thread ranking the women connected to Cairo Han, and Simone did not appear until the footnotes. Even worse, Cairo made no effort to defend her afterward. The cruelty was not in the words alone. It was in how effortlessly he had said them. No hesitation. No guilt. Like describing furniture. Simone had read every comment in silence at the kitchen island while the penthouse sat empty around her. She had almost stayed home tonight. That part she would never tell anyone. For 20 minutes she had sat on the edge of the bed in her robe, staring at the closet door, calculating whether disappearing was still an option. Whether silence could still protect her the way it once had. Whether the version of herself that had endured 7 years of loneliness inside a marriage to one of the most feared men on the East Coast had anything left worth protecting at all. Then she heard his voice in her memory. Not the interview. Something worse. The night before the gala, through the cracked office door, she had heard Cairo's younger brother Jace speaking with the ease of a man who had never once considered being wrong. "She'll stay," Jace had said. "She always does." And Cairo, her husband, the man who once drove 4 hours in a rainstorm just to stand beside her at her father's grave, had gone quiet for too long before answering. "I know." 2 words. Quiet as a verdict. Simone had stood in the hallway with her hand against the wall until her breathing returned. Then she had walked to her closet, pulled the emerald gown from its garment bag, and begun getting dressed. Now she stood in the center of the Belmont Gala. And the room could not look away. The photographers who had spent the previous hour chasing tech billionaires from Beverly Hills and old money couples from Greenwich were now angled entirely toward her. Wealthy women who had whispered about the viral clip earlier that evening were now openly staring with expressions caught somewhere between guilt and fascination. Powerful men, the kind whose names appeared on federal watch lists and charity boards simultaneously, had stopped mid-conversation to track her movement across the marble floor. Simone noticed all of it. She also noticed the pity. It flickered across faces before admiration replaced it, that fraction of a second look that said they expected her to crumble. To search the room desperately for her husband. To confirm everything the internet had already decided about her. She gave them nothing. What would you do after a public humiliation like that? Stay home and disappear, or walk into the fire and let them see exactly who they underestimated? Tell us in the comments, because what Simone does next is going to divide this entire room. Before we go further, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Drop it in the comments right now. We read every single one, and we want to know how far this story is traveling. Across the ballroom, behind a cluster of men in custom suits and a photographer angling for the perfect shot, Cairo Han stood completely still. At 42, Cairo was not a man who froze. He had sat across negotiating tables from people who had attempted to end his life. He had received news of organizational crises mid-dinner and finished his meal before responding. Men twice his age feared the particular quality of his silences. But right now, with Simone walking through his event like she owned the air inside it, Cairo Han had stopped breathing. Beside him, Celeste Vale, 24 years old, silver couture, the kind of beautiful that required constant maintenance, followed his gaze across the room and found the source. Her expression shifted. "Who is that?" she asked. Cairo did not look at her when he answered. "My wife." Celeste went quiet in a way she had not been all evening. Something moved behind her eyes, a recalculation happening in real time, the sudden awareness that she had walked into a room and misread every dynamic inside it. She looked at Simone again. Then she looked at Cairo's face. And for the first time tonight, Celeste Vale looked nervous. Cairo's security team was already tracking Simone's movement. 2 men near the east corridor had shifted position without being told. Another had pressed his earpiece and lowered his voice. The entire apparatus of protection that Cairo had built around his life was now quietly, automatically recalibrating around the presence of his own wife. Simone saw none of this. Or perhaps she saw all of it and simply did not care. Because she did not walk toward Cairo. She did not slow down near him. Did not glance in his direction. Did not give him the acknowledgement that every person watching silently expected, the inevitable gravitational pull of a wife toward her husband, even an estranged one. Instead, Simone Hayes crossed the full width of the ballroom with measured, unhurried steps. Toward Adrian Cross. Billionaire philanthropist. Longtime rival investor. A man Cairo had despised for years across boardrooms in New York and Los Angeles. Adrian rose from his chair the moment he saw her coming, and something about the ease of his movement suggested he had been expecting her. He took her hand. Kissed it once, slowly, with cameras tracking every second. The room erupted in whispers that moved like current through water. Cairo's jaw tightened. Adrian leaned close and said something directly into Simone's ear. Whatever it was, 4 words, maybe 5, it changed her expression completely. Not grief. Not fear. Something colder than both. And whatever Adrian Cross had just told Simone Hayes, it was the last thing in that ballroom anyone expected her to hear tonight. Subscribe now, because the truth Adrian just whispered into Simone's ear is the secret that will unravel everything Cairo Han spent 20 years building. And you do not want to be the last person in the room to find out what it is. 6 hours before Simone walked into that ballroom, she was sitting in a dead woman's living room. Not literally. Vivian Mercer was still alive, barely 73, wrapped in a wool cardigan despite the mild Greenwich evening, hands folded too tightly in her lap. But the house around her felt like something preserved rather than lived in. Heavy curtains pulled against the rain. Framed photographs arranged with the precision of someone who had stopped adding new ones. The smell of old paper and something floral that had long since faded to a memory of itself. Simone had driven the 40 minutes from Manhattan alone. No driver. No explanation left behind. Vivian had called that morning using a number Simone barely recognized, a landline, the kind nobody kept anymore, and said only 4 words before hanging up. Come before the gala. Vivian had known Simone's family since before Simone was born. Her late husband, a quiet man who had spent 3 decades working somewhere adjacent to federal intelligence and never fully explained where, had been close friends with Simone's father in Boston. After he passed, Vivian maintained the connection the way women of her generation maintained everything, through patience, through letters, through showing up when it mattered. She had warned Simone about Cairo's world twice in 7 years. Simone had not listened either time. Now Vivian set a sealed envelope on the coffee table between them and pressed both palms flat against her knees like she needed something solid beneath her. "I kept this for 19 years, Vivian said. "I kept it because I was afraid. And I kept it because I hoped I'd never need to give it to you." Simone looked at the envelope without touching it. "What is it?" "The truth about your father." The rain picked up against the windows. Somewhere in the back of the house, a clock measured the silence between them. Simone's father had died when she was 16. A robbery in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, wrong place, wrong night, wrong man walking home from a late audit meeting. That was the story. That had always been the story. The kind of loss that came with no answers and no targets, just a hollow space where a person used to be. She picked up the envelope. Inside were photographs, financial records, and a 2-page document with a federal district header that had been partially redacted. Simone moved through each item slowly. Her face stayed controlled the way it always did when something inside her was fracturing beyond the point of visible repair. Her father had been a financial auditor. In the months before he died, he had been contracted to review accounts connected to a Boston real estate partnership, a mid-sized development group with ties to several out-of-state investment firms. Routine work. The kind he did every quarter. Except the accounts were not routine. Buried inside the partnership structure were financial transfers moving through shell companies registered in Delaware and routed through a freight logistics group operating out of New York Harbor. The numbers were irregular. The routing was designed to be invisible to anyone not looking specifically for it. Her father had been looking specifically for it. He had flagged it. He had documented it. He had begun drafting a formal notice to send to the State Financial Oversight Board. He was dead within 3 weeks of drafting that document. The logistics group, Simone said quietly, holding the second photograph. "This is connected to the Han organization." Vivian did not answer immediately. "The order to silence him came from inside that network," she finally said. "My husband discovered it 2 years after your father passed. He could not prove it publicly without endangering both of us. So he documented everything he could find and gave it to me to hold." Simone set the photograph down. Then she picked it up again. Because in the lower right corner, partially cut by the frame, stood 2 men she recognized. One was Jace Han. Younger, mid-20s, maybe, but unmistakable. The slight smile. The eyes that moved too fast for someone pretending to be casual. Beside him stood a man Simone had only recently come to know. Thinner than he was now. Younger. But the posture was identical, the relaxed certainty of someone who had never once doubted that the room belonged to him. Adrian Cross. Simone's hands went still against the paper. "Vivian. That," she said carefully, "is the question I cannot answer for you. Could you stay beside someone connected to the worst loss of your life, even if you weren't certain they knew? Even if loving them was the most real thing you'd felt in years? Drop your answer in the comments. Because what Simone decides in the next 30 minutes will change everything." Simone drove back to Manhattan through the rain without turning on the radio. The penthouse was empty when she arrived. Cairo had already left with Celeste. His cologne still hung faintly near the entrance, that specific scent, clean and expensive and completely controlled, the same one she had pressed her face against during nightmares about her father in the early years of their marriage. He had held her those nights without asking questions. Without needing to understand. Just present, solid, certain in the dark. She stood in the center of the bedroom and let herself feel that memory for exactly 30 seconds. Then she walked to the closet and pulled out the emerald gown. She dressed methodically. She pinned her hair with precision. She attached the diamonds at her throat last, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had taken 7 years to write. Before leaving, she picked up the envelope from the bed where she had set it down. She had already reviewed every document. She knew what was inside. But something made her open it one final time. She lifted the photographs again, and stopped. Beneath the images she had already seen, there was one more. Smaller. Older, based on the grain of the print and the color of the light. It showed a man standing outside a building in what looked like the Back Bay area of Boston. Late afternoon, based on the shadows. He was in a dark coat, turned slightly toward the camera as if he had just noticed it. Simone recognized the building. Her father had audited accounts out of that exact address. And the man in the photograph standing outside it was Cairo. Years before the robbery. Years before Miami. Years before any version of their story that Simone had ever been told. Her hand tightened around the photograph until the edge of it pressed into her palm. She did not put it back. She tucked it carefully into her small evening bag, closed the clasp, and walked out of the penthouse without looking back. Some secrets wait 20 years for exactly the right moment. And tonight, Simone Hayes was about to find out whether the man she married was her greatest love, or the architect of her greatest loss. Don't go anywhere. Chapter 3 is where the room stops breathing. The moment Adrian Cross kissed Simone's hand, 17 cameras moved in her direction. She did not flinch. Did not smile too wide or too carefully. She simply allowed it, the way someone allows attention they have earned rather than borrowed, and let Adrian settle her hand into the crook of his arm as they turned to face the ballroom together. The effect was immediate and total. Within 4 minutes, the Belmont Foundation Gala had reorganized itself around Simone Hayes. Not consciously. That was the particular power of it. No one made a decision. No one chose to shift. It simply happened the way weather happens, a pressure system moving through a room, rearranging everything in its path without announcing itself. Women who had whispered behind champagne glasses 20 minutes earlier were suddenly finding reasons to move closer. A Connecticut socialite who had posted something sharp about the invisible wife on her private account that morning appeared at Simone's left elbow with a warmth that looked almost genuine. 3 men from the Beverly Hills investment contingent, old money, the kind that never needed to announce itself, straightened instinctively as she passed, the way men straighten when they suddenly understand they have been looking at the wrong person all evening. Adrian stayed close. Attentive without being obvious about it. He directed Simone through conversations with the practiced ease of someone guiding a ship into a harbor he had mapped long ago, steering her toward the right people, keeping her away from others, whispering names and context into her ear before introductions. Simone accepted the guidance while filing every choice he made into a separate internal drawer. She noticed who he avoided. She noticed who he steered her toward and why. She noticed that his hand at the small of her back was never quite touching her, hovering, like someone performing warmth rather than feeling it. None of this showed on her face. Across the ballroom, Cairo Han had not moved from where he was standing when Simone first emerged from the elevator. His body had shifted. He had accepted a fresh drink from a passing server. He had exchanged brief words with a senator from New York who had leaned in with the posture of someone delivering information rather than making conversation. But his attention had not left Simone for a single moment. Celeste had noticed within the first 10 minutes. She was not naive. 24 years old and built for rooms like this, she understood attention and its geography, who had it, who wanted it, who had lost it. She had watched Cairo's composure change in real time and made the calculation that most women in her position made when they understood the landscape had shifted beneath them. "You never look at me like that," she said quietly. Cairo did not answer. "Do you still love her?" He took a slow breath. Set his glass down on a nearby ledge. And for a moment that stretched 4 full seconds, he said absolutely nothing. That silence was its own answer. Celeste picked up her own glass, straightened her silver gown, and did not ask again. The auction began at 9:15. A foundation representative took the podium near the marble staircase and walked through the evening's featured charitable programs, educational initiatives in Newark, arts funding across Chicago's South Side, housing partnerships in Atlanta and Detroit. The room shifted into the polished half-attention of wealthy people preparing to spend money in public. Simone bid on nothing for the first 40 minutes. Then the representative announced the final item, a major endowment opportunity for arts education programs specifically supporting black girls in underfunded communities across New York and Chicago. Simone raised her paddle. $5 million. The representative paused. The room paused with him. Simone's expression did not change. She sat with the straightness of someone who had made this decision long before tonight and was simply executing it. In the name of Simone Hayes. Not Han. Hayes. Her maiden name. Her father's name. The name connected to a man who had been silenced for discovering exactly the kind of financial corruption that had funded rooms like this one for decades. For one full second, the ballroom was completely still. Then it rose. The standing ovation started near the front tables and swept backward through the room like a tide reversing itself. Cameras fired in continuous bursts. Phones came up across every table. A woman near the back began crying in the specific way people cry when something touches a part of them they had forgotten was still tender. Cairo stood in the applause like a man watching his own life rearrange itself without his permission. He had spent years building an empire. He had earned fear from people who should have feared him. He had controlled rooms, negotiations, outcomes. He had done what his father built the Han name to do. And in 9 words, $5 million, Simone Hayes, his wife had received more genuine respect in 30 seconds than he had manufactured in a decade. He remembered Miami suddenly. Not the auction where they met. After. The rooftop of a hotel in South Beach, 2 a.m, the Atlantic black and limitless beyond the railing. He had been telling her something he had never told anyone, something about his father, about the weight of the Han name, about the particular loneliness of running an empire built on silence. She had listened without flinching. She had not looked at him like he was dangerous or powerful or worth being afraid of. She had looked at him like he was simply a man who needed to be heard. He had been obsessed with her from that moment. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was the only person in his world who had ever looked directly at him and seen something worth staying for. He had spent 7 years repaying that gift by making her invisible. Quiet people notice everything. That's exactly why they're dangerous. If you think Simone came to this gala just to reclaim her dignity, you're watching the wrong story. Something much larger is moving underneath all of this. The applause was still fading when Cairo's head of security appeared at his shoulder. The man said nothing. He simply held out his phone with the screen facing up. Cairo read the message. His expression did not shift. That was how his face worked, absorbing information that would make other men flinch without producing so much as a visible breath. He pocketed the phone. Near the east corridor, 3 men in dark suits had entered the ballroom. They moved the way people move when they are trying not to be noticed and have the training to almost succeed at it. No badges visible. No earpieces showing. But the particular economy of their movement, the way they scanned without appearing to scan, the spacing between them, the fact that all 3 were angled toward the same quadrant of the room, was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Federal agents. Powerful men near the bar began excusing themselves from conversations with the fluid ease of people who had prepared exit strategies long before needing them. A Hollywood investor from Beverly Hills found his jacket. A Connecticut real estate developer suddenly remembered a call. The social temperature of the room dropped several degrees without a single visible reason. The agents were not moving toward Cairo. They were moving toward Jace. Jace Han had been standing near the east wall for most of the evening, watching Simone with an attention that was different from Cairo's. Where Cairo's gaze had been possessive, Jace's was calculating, the steady focus of someone accounting for variables. He felt the shift in the room before the agents were halfway across the floor. Simone, standing beside Adrian near the auction podium, was looking in Jace's direction when it happened. Jace turned his head. He looked at her directly, not the way you look at someone accidentally, not the way you look at someone you're trying to avoid. He looked at her the way you look at someone you have been watching for a very long time and have finally decided to acknowledge. He smiled once. Small. Controlled. Almost private, like the smile was meant specifically for her. Then he stepped sideways through a door beside the east corridor and disappeared. The agents reached the empty space where he had been standing within 15 seconds. Simone did not move. She stood with her hands folded, her expression giving away nothing, the evening bag closed in her grip with the photograph still inside it. Across the ballroom, Cairo had already turned toward her. He was not moving yet. Just watching. But his face had changed in a way that Simone recognized from 7 years of studying it, the particular stillness that came over him when his mind had shifted from managing a situation to deciding what it actually was. He was no longer looking at her like his wife. He was looking at her like a variable he had failed to account for. And the question moving behind his eyes, the one he had not yet spoken and would not speak until he had her alone, was the one that would change everything between them before the night was finished. Did she do this? Did the woman he had spent years underestimating just bring federal agents into his own event? Or was she something even more dangerous than that, a woman who had known the truth about his family long before tonight, and had said absolutely nothing? Subscribe right now, because Chapter 4 is where Cairo corners Simone on the rooftop in the rain, and what she hands him in that envelope is going to break something in him that has never been broken before. If you're not subscribed, you will miss the moment this entire story turns. The rooftop door opened before Simone reached it. Cairo had been waiting. He stood near the far railing with his back to the Manhattan skyline, jacket still on, hands at his sides, the particular stillness of a man who had been rehearsing this conversation in his head for the last 40 minutes and was now measuring every word before releasing it. Rain fell in a soft, steady curtain across the terrace. The city glowed beneath the clouds, 43 floors below, indifferent to everything happening above it. Simone walked out without slowing. "You embarrassed me tonight," Cairo said. His voice had no temperature. That was the thing about Cairo that most people never understood, he did not get louder when he was dangerous. He got quieter. The absence of warmth in his tone was more threatening than shouting would have been. Simone stopped 6 feet from him and looked at him the way she had spent 7 years learning not to. Directly. "That's what hurts you." It was not a question. Not humiliating your wife in front of millions of people. Not the interview. Not showing up tonight with a model on your arm. What hurts you is that I didn't disappear quietly. Did you leak information to the FBI? She laughed. The sound of it surprised even her, short and bitter and completely without humor, the kind of laugh that only comes out when something has passed the point of grief and landed somewhere harder. Your brother destroyed my family. The rain ticked against the railing between them. Cairo's expression did not move. That was how she knew the words had landed, not because his face changed, but because for 1 full second, nothing moved at all. Not his hands. Not his jaw. Not even his eyes. Just complete stillness, like a system processing something it was not built to receive. What did you just say? Simone opened her evening bag. She placed the envelope on the wet railing between them. The photographs. The financial records. The partially redacted federal document with her father's audit notes typed neatly across the top and the routing numbers that led, with patience and clarity, directly back to the Hahn organization's freight operations in New York Harbor. Cairo picked up the document slowly. He read in silence. The only sound was rain and the distant pulse of the city below and the faint movement of Cairo's breathing as it changed, almost imperceptibly, but Simone had spent 7 years sleeping beside this man and she heard it, the specific shift that happened when something reached him past the defenses he had spent a lifetime constructing. His father had warned him once. Years ago, during a rare dinner alone in the family's original Brooklyn house before the Hahn name had grown into what it became. His father had sat across the table and said something that Cairo had filed away without fully understanding. Your brother wants things I would never give him. Watch what happens when he finds someone who will. Cairo had not thought about that dinner in over a decade. He was thinking about it now. He didn't tell me, Cairo said finally. His voice was lower. Not softer, lower. The difference between a man managing his emotions and a man whose emotions had just exceeded management. Simone watched him. Your father's auditor discovered the transfers, she said. He was going to report them. Jace gave the order to have him silenced before the notice reached the oversight board. My father died 3 weeks after he filed the first internal flag. She paused. I was 16 years old. Cairo set the documents down. He did not look at her when he reached out, one hand moving toward her arm the way you reach for something you're afraid has already slipped past you. Slow. Uncertain in a way that Cairo Hahn was never uncertain about anything. Simone stepped back. Not dramatically. Just one step. Enough. His hand stayed in the air for a moment before dropping. That was when it hit him. Not the evidence. Not the records. Not even the truth about her father. The step back. 7 years of emotional distance that he had created, of doors closed and conversations redirected and a woman's loyalty slowly compressed into something she could carry alone, all of it arrived at once in the space between his outstretched hand and her arm. He had built that distance himself. One absence at a time. And now he was standing on the other side of it with no one to blame but the choices he had made while telling himself she would always be there. Can love survive after trust is gone? Would you forgive someone who didn't know, but whose world destroyed everything you loved? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because what Cairo does next is going to divide every person watching this story. The Hahn organization fractured before sunrise. By the time Cairo came back inside and made 2 calls from the Gala's private business suite, the loyalists were already choosing sides in real time across Miami, Los Angeles, and a private compound outside Las Vegas. Some sided with Jace out of self-preservation, he had always run the operations closer to the ground, and they believed Cairo had grown soft. Others feared what Cairo's rage would look like once it had a fixed target. Jace had vanished from New York completely. No flight records under his name. No hotel reservations. No movement through any of the 3 properties the Hahn organization maintained between Long Island and northern New Jersey. He had slipped out of the Gala through a side exit and into a car that had been positioned and waiting, which meant the exit had been planned before the federal agents ever entered the building. Which meant Jace had known they were coming. Simone stayed in a suite at a midtown hotel that night under a name Cairo's head of security arranged. She sat on the edge of the bed with the television off and the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling window and tried to build something solid out of the wreckage of what she thought she had known. At 11:47, Cairo's personal phone rang. The number was from a Seattle area code he did not recognize. He almost let it go. He answered on the 4th ring. The voice on the other end was male. Older. Breathless in a way that suggested the call had been considered and delayed and reconsidered multiple times before the man finally made himself dial. I worked for your father's accounting firm for 9 years, the voice said. I have been carrying something that does not belong to me. Cairo said nothing. He waited. The explosion that killed your father. The man's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. It wasn't an accident. The line went dead. 3 seconds of silence. Then the Seattle number disconnected entirely, and no amount of calling it back produced anything except a generic carrier message telling Cairo the number was no longer in service. He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time. Outside, Manhattan kept moving, taxis and late-night pedestrians and the endless electric hum of a city that never fully went dark. The same city where his father built the Han name from nothing. The same city where Cairo had spent decades protecting an empire without ever fully understanding who was living inside it with him. He set the phone down on the desk. Picked up his jacket. And for the first time in his adult life, Cairo Han had no idea what move to make next. The call came at 6 in the morning. Simone was already awake, had been since 4, sitting in the dark Boston hotel room with the curtains open and the harbor visible in the gray pre-dawn light, watching cargo ships move slowly through the water the way her father once described loving the ocean. Patient. Indifferent to how long things took. She had moved to Boston the previous night under private security that Cairo arranged without being asked to. She had not thanked him. She was not certain she could. Every major news network had found the angle by midnight. The Belmont Gala footage was everywhere, Simone entering alone, the auction, the standing ovation, the federal agents moving through the crowd. Commentators had filled 48 hours of airtime debating whether the anonymous tip that exposed Jace Han came from inside the organization or from the famously humiliated wife who showed up uninvited and donated $5 million under her maiden name. Nobody had the real answer yet. The call that morning was from a Greenwich hospital. Vivian Mercer had been found inside her home by a neighbor who noticed the front door open in the rain. She had been attacked sometime in the early hours. She was alive, but barely, and she had asked for Simone by name before losing consciousness in the ambulance. Simone was in a car heading south within 12 minutes. The hospital was quiet the way hospitals are always quiet at that hour, not peaceful, just suspended, like a building holding its breath between crises. A nurse led Simone to a room at the end of a corridor where Vivian lay connected to monitors, her face carrying the specific stillness of someone who has been through something violent and is now rationing what energy remains. Vivian opened her eyes when Simone sat down. "Adrian," she said. Just the name. Her voice was thin but certain. Simone leaned closer. Vivian had pieced it together in the weeks before the gala, not all of it, but enough. Adrian Cross had known about Simone's father for years. He had obtained the same evidence Vivian's husband compiled and had been sitting on it, waiting. Not for justice. For leverage. He had watched the Han organization for over a decade looking for the moment when the information would do the most damage, and the Gala humiliation had given him the perfect opening, a wounded woman, a public insult, a room full of cameras. He had not given Simone the truth to help her. He had used her grief as a weapon aimed at Cairo. He was there, Vivian said, her hand tightening weakly around Simone's wrist. When it happened to your father. He didn't give the order. But he knew. And afterward, he helped make sure nothing pointed back. Jace gave the order. Adrian cleaned up what Jace left behind. And then Adrian had spent 19 years positioning himself as the man who would eventually use that secret to destroy the Han Empire and absorb its international shipping routes into his own portfolio. Simone sat with that information inside her chest for a long moment. She thought about Adrian's hand at the small of her back during the gala. The warmth he performed so precisely. The names he had whispered to her before introductions, steering her, placing her, using her presence in that room like a chess piece he had spent years waiting to move. Her throat tightened. Not with grief this time. With something colder. Power hides the truth for as long as it can. But grief, real grief, the kind that lives in the body for decades, that exposes everyone eventually. And if you've stayed with this story this far, hold on. Because what arrives next breaks the one person nobody expected to break. Cairo walked into the hospital corridor 2 hours later. He carried a leather folio that looked too heavy for what it was and set it on the small table beside Simone's chair without greeting her. He looked like a man who had not slept and had no intention of pretending otherwise, jacket gone, collar open, the particular flatness in his eyes that came not from composure but from having moved past the point where composure was relevant. He opened the folio. Inside were financial ledgers recovered from an accountant who had worked for Jace's private operations, not the man in Seattle, but a separate source that Cairo's remaining loyal team had located through a commercial property connected to Jace's freight operations in Miami. The ledgers documented the trafficking network Jace had built through the Miami port system over a period of 11 years. Shipping containers. Transit routes between South Florida and the Gulf Coast. Financial transfers moved through 3 layers of shell companies before landing in accounts that had no visible connection to the Han organization. Cairo's father had discovered it. In the same year Simone's father died in Boston, Cairo's father had confronted Jace privately about what he found inside the organization's Miami operations. He had given Jace 30 days to shut it down voluntarily before he took the information to the organization's internal counsel. 22 days later, the car explosion happened. Ruled an accident. Investigated for 6 weeks and then quietly closed when 2 of the lead detectives assigned to the case transferred out of their precincts within the same month. Cairo had spent 14 years building the Han Empire larger and more powerful than his father ever had, working inside a structure that Jace had specifically designed to keep him moving forward, busy, effective, and looking in every direction except the one where the truth was kept. He had protected the man who murdered his father without knowing it for over a decade. When he finished laying out the documents, Cairo sat down in the chair across from Simone and put both hands flat on his knees. He was quiet for a long time. Then something moved through his face that Simone had never seen in 7 years of marriage, in 2 years of courtship, in every moment of crisis and tension and late-night silence between them. His jaw shifted. His eyes went unfocused for just a moment, not blank, but turned inward, towards something private and enormous. His shoulders moved like a man who has been carrying weight for so long that putting it down is physically disorienting. And Cairo Han, the man that federal agents tracked and rivals feared and loyalists followed without question, lowered his head and wept. Not performance. Not strategy. Not the controlled emotional display of someone managing a room. Just a son who had finally understood what was taken from him, and a husband sitting across from the woman whose loss had been taken first. Simone did not move immediately. She watched him the way you watch something you have needed to see for a long time and are not yet sure how to hold. She saw the version of him she had first loved in Miami, the man underneath the power, the one who had been lonely in ways that empire could not fix. She saw what 7 years of cruelty and arrogance and emotional distance had cost both of them. She also knew, sitting in that hospital corridor with Vivian's monitors beeping softly through the closed door, that love and accountability were not the same thing. That she could understand his grief and still require him to face what his world had done. But she did not leave. Cairo straightened after a moment. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, the gesture completely unguarded, and looked at her. "Don't disappear yet," he said quietly. "Please." Simone held his gaze. 3 hours later, his secure phone buzzed with a location. Palm Beach. A private estate near the marina. Jace and Adrian were there, forged diplomatic documents ready, a departure window scheduled for before sunrise. Cairo stood. Picked up the folio. walked to where his jacket was folded over the back of a chair and reached into the inside pocket with the practiced quiet of a man who had carried a weapon long enough that the motion required no thought. He loaded it slowly. Then he turned and looked at Simone. "If I go alone tonight," he said, "I may not come back." He did not ask her to follow. He did not ask her to stay. He left the choice in the space between them and walked toward the corridor without waiting for her answer. The storm came in from the Atlantic without much warning. By the time Cairo's vehicles reached the Palm Beach estate, the wind off the water had gone from humid to violent, bending the palms along the private drive sideways and driving rain in horizontal sheets across the marina below. Lightning moved through the cloud cover over the ocean in long, branching flashes that lit the estate grounds in sharp white intervals, the dock, the main house, the seawall where a 60-foot vessel was running at low idle with its navigation lights on. Someone was planning to leave within the hour. Cairo's team moved through the estate grounds from 3 directions simultaneously. Trained men, the ones who had stayed loyal not out of obligation but out of something older and more personal than obligation. They communicated in short, clipped radio exchanges and positioned themselves near the dock access, the east gate, and the main house entrance with the efficiency of people who had done this before in worse conditions. Cairo himself went straight for the main house. Inside, Jace was standing in the center of a vaulted living room with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the water. He had a glass in his hand. He was dressed for travel, dark clothes, nothing that would stand out in an airport. The diplomatic packet sat on the table beside him, thick with documents that had cost significant money and favors to fabricate. He did not look surprised when the door opened. "I wondered how long it would take you," Jace said. Cairo stepped inside and let the door fall shut behind him. The storm pressed against the windows. Rain ran down the glass in thick, moving sheets. "You killed our father." Jace set his glass down. His expression shifted, not into guilt, but into the specific look of a man recalculating how much he needed to explain. He was going to destroy everything the family built. He was going to stop you from running children through Miami shipping containers. The words landed in the room like something physical. Jace was quiet for a moment. "He didn't understand the scope of what we were building," he said finally. He was thinking small. He was always thinking small. He was thinking about who we were supposed to be. Down at the dock, the sound of the vessel's engine shifted, someone increasing the idle, preparing to move. Adrian was making his run. Cairo's radio cracked with a single transmission from his team near the marina. "Cross is on the dock. He has the drives." Cairo looked at his brother for one more second. "The FBI already knows where you are," he said. "I called them 40 minutes ago." Jace's composure broke for the first time. He moved fast, toward the east corridor, toward the private exit his team had mapped weeks earlier. Cairo's men were already there. The sounds that followed were brief and contained and ended with Jace Hahn face down on the marble floor of the estate's east hallway with his hands secured behind him. At the dock, Adrian had one foot on the vessel's gangway when the figures appeared at the seawall above him. He pivoted immediately, not toward the boat, but back toward the estate grounds, calculating a route through the security toward the vehicles parked at the north gate. The encrypted drives were in a waterproof case in his left hand. Hundreds of millions in documented financial architecture. His exit strategy. His leverage. He came around the corner of the boat shed and found Simone standing in the rain. She had arrived 20 minutes after Cairo, alone, in a car she drove herself from the hospital, wearing the same clothes she had been in since the gala. No security. No escort. Just her and the decision she had made when Cairo left that corridor without asking her to follow. Adrian grabbed her arm. His fingers locked around her wrist with the grip of a man who had calculated that Cairo would surrender everything to keep her safe, and had decided in the fraction of a second available to him that she was his fastest exit. He miscalculated. Simone drove her elbow backward into his ribs with the full force of someone who had been carrying controlled fury for 19 years and had finally found something in front of her worth releasing it on. Adrian's grip broke. She turned, stepped away from him, and put 6 feet of wet dock between herself and where he was standing bent forward in the rain. Cairo came around the corner of the boat shed 4 seconds later. He saw Adrian. He saw Simone. He looked at the space between them, the broken grip, her steady breathing, the fact that she was already clear and standing on her own 2 feet, and something moved through his face that was not relief alone. It was something older. Deeper. The look of a man finally understanding the full shape of who he married. He moved toward Adrian. Cairo. Simone's voice cut through the rain. He stopped. Don't become worse than them. The wind moved across the dock. Lightning flashed over the water. Cairo stood in the rain with his hands at his sides and the decision visible in every muscle of his posture, the weight of it, the cost of it, the specific difficulty of choosing restraint when everything in him wanted something else entirely. He stepped back. Federal vehicles came through the north gate 3 minutes later, not with sirens, just with lights cutting through the storm and doors opening and agents moving across the estate grounds with the organized urgency of people who had been briefed and positioned and were now executing. Adrian did not make it to the gate. Jace was already in custody inside the east hallway. By morning, the arrests were on every network in the country. By afternoon, the story had reached international outlets covering the collapse of one of the most sophisticated financial criminal networks operating on the American East Coast. Corrupt city officials in Miami and New York resigned within 72 hours. A federal investigation expanded to include 3 offshore banking networks and 2 state-level political figures whose names had appeared in Jace's ledgers. Everyone who had spent years fearing the Han name waited to see what Cairo would do. What he did was call his attorneys and begin the process of dismantling. Not because he was forced to. Not because the evidence left him no choice. He had enough buried and protected that a legal fight could have lasted years. He began the process because he sat in a conference room in Manhattan 3 days after Palm Beach and looked at everything the Han name had built and understood, for the first time without insulation between himself and the truth, what it had cost. His father. Simone's father. 7 years of a marriage he had treated like a possession instead of a partnership. A woman's loyalty he had converted into invisibility and called it protection. Simone asked him why, the morning the first documents were filed. He answered without looking away from her. Because power without humanity destroyed everyone I loved. Months passed. Manhattan moved the way Manhattan always moved, forward, indifferent to what it left behind, already organizing itself around the next event, the next name, the next room full of powerful people performing their importance beneath crystal chandeliers. Another gala. A different foundation. The same glass towers and the same string quartets and the same cameras looking for the story worth telling that evening. Simone walked in beside Cairo. Not behind him. Beside him. His hand at the small of her back, not possessive this time, not steering. Present. The difference was visible to anyone paying attention, and in that room, everyone was paying attention. The shift happened the way it had happened at the Belmont Gala months earlier, a pressure moving through the crowd, people turning, cameras adjusting. But this time there was no pity in the room. No whispers about the invisible wife or the viral clip or the model in silver couture. What the room saw was a woman who had walked through the worst version of her life and come out the other side carrying the truth that broke an empire. Cairo watched her move through the room and felt something he had not felt in years. Not pride of ownership. Not the satisfaction of having a remarkable woman beside him. Something quieter and more permanent than both. Across the ballroom, a federal prosecutor standing near the bar received a message on his phone. He read it twice. Then he looked up slowly from the screen toward the center of the room. The message contained 4 words. There are still names. The prosecutor's gaze found Cairo. Cairo noticed. He held the look for exactly 1 second, calm, unreadable, giving away nothing. Then he turned back to Simone. The woman he once called boring had become the only reason he still had a soul worth saving. And whatever came next, whatever names were still missing from whatever investigation was still building in whatever federal office was preparing its next move, Cairo Han faced it for the first time without the weight of a lie beneath his feet. That was enough. For now. If this story moved you, if Simone's strength, Cairo's grief, or the truth that survived 20 years of burial touched something real in you, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications. We tell stories here that stay with you. Stories about power and loyalty and the people everyone underestimates until it is far too late. Every week, a new story drops, and you do not want to be the last one to find it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.